15 seconds. That is all it took for my father-in-law to look me straight in the eye at his perfect Scottsdale Christmas party and fling a single crumpled dollar bill at my face like he was paying a street musician. $1? That was the price he decided my existence was worth in front of his entire family. I did not know it then, but that moment would burn a hole through every part of my life and force open a truth I had held down for 3 long years. I remember the sound of the dollar fluttering when it hit my cheek. Soft and humiliating, like someone had tapped me with a cheap paper insult. The room went quiet just long enough for the sting to settle. Then laughter erupted around the table. My name is Aaron Blake, and on that Christmas night in December 2021, I learned just how far a family could go to strip a man of dignity. The night had started like every other Harper gathering. Everything inside their Scottsdale house was staged for intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a tree big enough for a luxury hotel lobby, platters of food arranged like they were auditioning for a magazine spread. I walked in with my wife Claire, telling myself to breathe, to stay calm, to survive another holiday under the same roof as people who smiled at her and sneered at me. Her mother Linda greeted us first. She leaned in to kiss Claire and brushed past me with a tight grin that never reached her eyes. Her perfume hit me harder than her greeting. It was sharp and powdery and smelled like a woman who wanted to cover something up. Her father, Harold Harper, followed behind her. He carried the quiet arrogance of a man who had controlled his family for decades and believed no one would ever challenge him. His voice was smooth when he spoke to Claire, but when he glanced at me, something cold tightened across his jaw. Ryan showed up next. The golden son, younger than Claire, always well-dressed, always smirking, always waiting for the perfect moment to jab. He looked me up and down as we took off our coats. Working hard these days, Aaron still stuck at middle management. That was about the way he said hello. I ignored it. I had learned that was the only way to get through a Harper holiday without starting a war. Dinner stretched down a long table dressed in white linen and silver candles. Everyone else sat close together. Talking like the best parts of life happened only in their presence. Claire squeezed my hand under the table, trying to anchor me. But she was shaking more than I was. She loved her family even when they hurt her. And they hurt her more than she would ever admit. I tried to keep my focus on her voice as she whispered something about the roasted turkey, about the music, anything to distract me. But conversation drifted around us, little darts thrown my way. Ryan mentioned the salary he believed I should have had by now. Linda asked Claire if she still felt safe financially with me. Harold asked me about my company Northcrest, but not in a curious way. More like a man poking an animal to see if it reacts. And I stayed quiet. Because there are moments when a man can defend himself, and moments when defending himself only gives his enemies the satisfaction of watching him try. Then Harold stood. His wine glass caught the light and drew every eye to him. He smiled the way men smile before announcing a toast. But the tone in the room shifted long before he opened his mouth. Something in the back of my throat tightened. I felt Claire stiffen beside me. He thanked everyone for coming. He joked about the chaos of the season. He spoke about gratitude, generosity, family values. It was a performance polished enough to fool anyone who did not know him. Then he reached into the pocket of his tailored coat. I saw the small movement before anyone else. The slow pinch of his fingers holding something thin and folded. The corners of a bill. When he pulled it out and held it between 2 fingers, his smile twisted into something hateful. The laughter at the table faded into a quiet anticipation, like everyone subconsciously understood a line was about to be crossed. He flicked the bill at me with a little snap of his wrist. The room watched the trajectory like it was part of a show. It hit my cheek and fell onto my plate, right next to the glazed carrots I had barely touched. $1? "That is all you are worth in this house," he said. No one breathed. Then it started small. A laugh from someone near the middle, then another, and soon the entire table shook with amusement. Except Claire. She was frozen, her face drained, her hand still in mine but trembling hard enough to hurt. I waited for the flush of anger to hit me. The instinct to stand up, to shout, to shove the chair back and walk out. But none of that came. Instead, something else happened inside me. Everything went quiet. The voices, the laughter, even my own heartbeat. It was like someone pulled a frost-covered curtain across the moment and left only the cold. I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small yellowed envelope. It was worn at the edges because I had handled it hundreds of times since receiving it in 2018. I had never opened it in front of anyone. Not even Claire. I set it on the table gently, right beside the dollar. "You might want to open that," I said. Harold blinked. Confused at first, then annoyed, then amused as if he believed I was trying to restore my pride with something pitiful. He reached for the envelope with a smirk. The room leaned in. Even the music from the speakers seemed distant, muffled, Claire whispered. "Aaron, what is that?" But her voice sounded far away. Harold slid a thumb under the flap and began to open it. His smile thinned. The paper inside was thicker than he expected. Several sheets, old, official, the kind of documents men like him preferred to keep buried. He pulled the first page halfway out. His face changed in a single beat. The laughter around the table collapsed into confusion and hushes and the dragging silence of people sensing something dangerous. Harold stared at the document like he had just seen a ghost wearing his own handwriting. The muscles in his jaw twitched. His eyes flicked to me with a look I had never seen in him before. Recognition and fear. He had not even finished pulling the paper out. And already the entire night had shifted. I sat there, hands steady, pulse steady, while Harold Harper looked down at the first piece of truth he had spent more than a decade trying to hide. I knew exactly what was coming next, and he knew it too. He did not have to read more than a few lines before the color drained out of his face. But the moment froze there for me. The room disappeared. The laughter, the ornaments, the smell of cinnamon. All of it faded while I sat in that heavy silence and felt the past reach up like a hand around my throat. The envelope had lived inside my jacket for 3 years before that night, and I carried it with the same tension a soldier might feel carrying a live grenade. It was strange watching the man who had tormented me open something that had haunted me long before it ever touched his hands. The memory of when it began still hits me as sharply as the cold that winter in 2018. Claire and I had just moved into a small townhouse on the north side of Phoenix. We were newly married, still hopeful, still pretending that her family might eventually accept me if I just kept my head down long enough. It was a Saturday morning. I remember the sun coming through the blinds and the smell of burnt toast because I had ruined breakfast again. Claire was laughing at me, barefoot in one of my t-shirts, spinning around the tiny kitchen like happiness came naturally to her. We were good then, before everything broke open. I stepped outside to grab a package I was expecting, but found something else instead. A plain envelope sitting on top of our welcome mat. No stamp, no return address, just my name written in a blocky hand that looked rushed. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, but told myself it was nothing. Bills, a neighbor leaving the wrong mail, spam, anything ordinary. Inside was not ordinary. I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope while Claire cracked eggs into a pan. I opened it casually at first, not expecting anything at all. But when I saw the first page, my breath stuck. Old financial documents, signatures, property records from Yavapai County. The words Sedona parcel transfer jumped out at me like they were written in neon. Numbers I did not understand yet, but felt dangerous. A signature that looked almost, but not quite like Claire's. Another page showing an authorization form from 2009 with her name attached to a property acquisition she could not possibly have participated in at 19. I kept flipping through page after page. A bank account in Harold Harper's name tied to recurring transfers. A commission payment record from 2017 with Ryan listed as a broker on a land deal he never mentioned. The documents smelled faintly of dust and ink, like they had been stored somewhere dark for years before finally reaching my hands. I remember Claire saying my name in that soft, distracted way people do when they do not realize something catastrophic is happening behind them. I folded the papers and slid them back inside before she could turn around. Not because I wanted to hide anything from her, because I did not understand it enough to even form words. I spent that night lying awake staring at the ceiling. Every possibility running through my head. Blackmail. Some kind of trap. A misunderstanding. Or the thing I feared most. A truth so ugly that no one had dared speak it. The next morning I made an appointment with an attorney I knew from a compliance seminar. Her name was Laura Kim. Strict, sharp, no patience for nonsense. She met me in her office in downtown Phoenix and spread the documents across her desk without any sugarcoating. She told me what I did not want to hear. Everything was real. Everything was illegal. And every line pointed back to Harold using Claire's name when she was still under his guardianship. A violation that could pull her straight into the middle of any investigation if it ever reached the wrong hands. I asked her what I should do. She looked me straight in the eye and said that if Harold ever sensed I had these documents, he would bury me or he would bury Claire to keep himself clean. That was the moment I understood this was not just a packet of forgotten papers. It was leverage. Or a bomb. Maybe both. I walked out of her office in a fog. The December air bit hard, and the traffic noise along Jefferson Street felt sharper than usual. I kept seeing Claire's face in my mind, the way she looked at her father, the way she still believed he had good left in him. How was I supposed to tell her he had turned her into a legal shield long before she knew what a contract even meant? A week passed before the next piece clicked into place. I got a call from an elderly woman named Evelyn Brooks, who lived near the Harpers for years. Her voice shook, like she was nervous to even be speaking the things she had carried for so long. She told me she remembered Harold sitting Claire down at the dining table when she was barely a teenager and pushing documents in front of her without explanation, telling her to sign quickly while Linda hovered behind her. She said she had seen him do it more than once. My throat tightened, listening to her. Suddenly the papers made sense. The patterns, the signatures, the timing. Claire had been nothing more than a convenient name on the line whenever Harold needed one. I thanked Evelyn. She hesitated before hanging up and said that someone else had once asked her questions about the Harpers. A man who used to work for Harold. A man who died suddenly the year before. I felt a cold realization settle in. Someone had tried to expose this once already. Someone who did not survive long enough to finish the job. The envelope began to feel heavier. Every time I checked my jacket pocket for it, my hand shook just slightly. I told myself I would bring it to Claire when the time was right. When I had enough understanding to protect her from the fallout. But days turned into weeks, and then into months, and she never stopped smiling at me with that open heart. Never stopped believing her father would one day soften toward me. I could not bring myself to crush that hope with something I barely comprehended, so I kept it. I hid it beneath receipts and work folders and the careful smile I wore every time we visited her parents. I researched in secret. Called Laura when I needed answers. Followed threads in county databases as quietly as I could. I learned more than I wanted to. I learned enough to know Harold was capable of things most fathers could not imagine doing to their children. The strangest part was how normal life looked from the outside. Claire baking on weekends, me commuting to North Crest, small fights over groceries or laundry like any married couple. But underneath all of that, I felt the envelope pulsing like a second heartbeat. The first real confrontation came a few months later. I was coming home late from work and found the mailbox half open. Inside was another envelope, smaller, with only one message on the slip of paper inside. Stop digging. The letters were printed mechanically. No handwriting, no name, no return address this time. I locked the door behind me, checked every window twice, then sat in the living room, staring at that thin piece of paper until Claire came home. I hid it before she could see. I did not sleep that night, or the next one. Every sound outside felt like footsteps. Every car slowing near our driveway made my stomach clench. But I could not tell Claire because she would demand answers, and I was terrified of what that conversation would force me to reveal. I kept waiting for the fear to fade. It never did. Instead, it hardened into something else, a resolve. I realized that whoever wanted this buried knew exactly how dangerous the truth was. And that meant I had no choice but to understand it completely, even if I had to do it alone. Looking back on it now, that envelope was not just evidence. It was the first proof that Harold's empire was rotting at the foundation. A foundation built on fraud, manipulation, and the blind loyalty of a daughter who never knew she had been used. By the time the next Christmas came around, I knew nearly everything Harold had tried to hide. I knew how he moved money. I knew how he used Ryan as a shield. I knew how he manipulated Claire since she was a kid. I knew he had every reason to fear me if I ever decided to pull the curtain back. And still, I kept the envelope sealed in my jacket the night we drove to Scottsdale for Christmas dinner in 2021. I told myself it was not the night to expose anything, that I could endure whatever they threw at me, that I would wait for the right moment. Then he threw that dollar at my face, 3 years of secrets pressed against my ribs as I watched him open that envelope at the dinner table. The room leaned forward. The world seemed to tilt. I saw the exact second Harold recognized the document in his hand. His pupils tightened. His breath hitched. His fingers twitched like he wanted to drop the paper but could not. And just before he lifted the next page, just before the truth began to surface, Claire reached for my arm under the table, not in anger or fear, but in something else entirely, a quiet plea she did not yet understand. The moment stretched and held, and I could feel everything that had been buried for years rising toward the surface at last. Claire's fingers tightened on my arm as if she sensed something shifting in the air, something buried and dangerous rising through the cracks in that perfect dining room. Her touch was small and trembling, and for a moment I could not look at her, because I knew what was coming would break something inside her that could not ever be repaired. Harold kept staring at the paper in his hand, pretending he still had control, pretending the room still belonged to him. But I saw the truth settle over his expression. He recognized the document, not in a vague way, not with confusion. He recognized it the way a man recognizes the weapon he once used on someone who could not fight back. He stuffed the page back into the envelope without reading the rest. His hand shook, but he tried to mask it by reaching for his wine glass. The stem clicked against the table. Everyone watched in an uneasy silence, and for the first time since I had known the Harpers, no one laughed. Claire whispered my name again, but softer this time, like she had lost her breath. I finally forced myself to look at her. Her eyes were already glassy. She glanced at the envelope, then at me, then back at her father. She did not know what any of it meant, but she knew it was bad, and she knew it involved her. Harold cleared his throat, trying to rebuild the illusion of control. He tossed the envelope aside and barked out something about nonsense and forged papers. But his voice carried a thin crack that no one missed. Linda leaned toward him, confusion written all over her face. Ryan looked uneasy, his knee bouncing under the table. His bravado suddenly drained. I felt something shift deep in my chest, a kind of cold clarity that only comes after years of being dismissed, mocked, pushed aside. I sat straighter. I waited. I watched them scramble for a narrative that would protect their pride. Harold pushed back from the table and jabbed a finger at me, his tone low enough that only a handful of people caught it. Do not start something you cannot finish. It was the wrong thing to say to a man who had been living under the weight of his secrets for years. The rest of the dinner unfolded in a haze after that. Harold ordered everyone to sit and eat. Linda tried to switch the conversation back to holiday gifts. Ryan attempted to joke about something on his phone, but no one was really participating. Every glance drifted toward the envelope lying on the linen tablecloth. The one thing in the room that no one dared touch. Later that night, after Claire and I finally escaped the house and drove home, the fight began. She stood in our kitchen with her coat still on, the lights buzzing overhead. What is going on, Aaron? Why did my dad react like that? What was in that envelope? Her voice cracked near the end. She looked like she was holding herself together with nothing but thin hope. I wanted to tell her everything right then. I wanted to lay out every document, every call, every late-night fear. But when I opened my mouth, the words caught. It was too much to throw at her all at once. Too heavy, too cruel. I told her I needed time to explain. She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine with an expression I had not seen in a long while. Not anger, not disappointment, hurt. The quiet kind. The kind that slowly hollows a person out. She whispered that she felt like something had been kept from her for a long time. And the guilt cut straight through me. I promised her that nothing in that envelope changed how I saw her, and that she was not the one I feared. She nodded, but it did not ease the weight between us. Over the next weeks, life slid into a strange rhythm. Outwardly, everything looked normal. Work, grocery runs, weekends at home. But underneath it all, the tension sat like a fog that never lifted. Claire watched me closely now, as if she were waiting for the moment my silence might betray her trust completely. When we visited her parents the next time, the atmosphere felt different, subtle, but sharp-edged. Linda greeted us with her usual brittle smile, but her eyes darted to Harold, then back to me. Ryan kept his distance. Even the house felt colder, the air too still, as if everyone inside was afraid to breathe wrong. During lunch, Claire excused herself to answer a work call, leaving me alone with her family at the table. Harold leaned forward and spoke just loud enough for me to hear. Whatever you think you know, you are playing a game you cannot win. I met his stare and did not look away. For once he saw something in me he had not expected. I was done being afraid of the man he pretended to be. When Claire returned, she slid into her seat and tried to smile at me, but I could see a fragile question behind her eyes. She sensed the storm pressing closer, but she had no idea how long it had been building. Later that afternoon, while Harold and Ryan argued in the den about something work-related, Linda pulled Claire aside near the hallway. I stayed in the living room, pretending to scroll my phone, but their voices carried enough for me to hear pieces. You need to stop letting him drag you into stress, Linda said. Marriage should not feel like you owe someone your sanity. Claire replied with something firm but strained. Mom, stop. You do not know anything about this. Linda stiffened. Then I heard her say it. The line that explained everything about the way Claire behaved around her parents. If you choose him over this family, do not come crying when you lose everything we gave you. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Emotional blackmail disguised as concern. A tactic I had seen from them too many times. Claire came back to the living room a minute later looking smaller somehow, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. But it was the kind of answer people give when they know the truth would break them if they spoke it out loud. The next shift happened one evening while I was working late in the home office. I heard Claire talking to herself in the kitchen. When I walked in, she was staring at a binder her father had given her years ago. Inside were old medical forms, school paperwork, and a stack of consent documents she faintly remembered signing. Her fingers hovered above one page. A signature that looked like hers, but had shapes she did not recognize. She asked me quietly if I thought her father might have used her name on things without her understanding what they were. I could hear Evelyn Brooks' voice in my memory. I could hear Laura's warning. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud enough to drown everything out. I told her the truth. I told her it was possible. She sat down heavily at the table. She pushed her hair back. She whispered that she always felt something was wrong growing up, but never had the courage to question it. The next words she said were soft, but they changed everything. Maybe this is why they never wanted me to leave the house. Maybe they needed my signature more than they needed me. She broke down crying. I held her through it, my mind spiraling with questions I was not ready to answer. For the next few days, she barely spoke to her parents. Linda left voicemails layered with guilt and panic. Ryan sent texts accusing me of poisoning Claire against her own family. Harold said nothing at all, which was worse. Silence from a man like him spoke louder than threats. One night, as Claire and I sat on the couch in near darkness, she whispered that she wanted to know everything I had been carrying. I told her I would show her, but only when I could piece together the timeline clearly enough for her to understand exactly how her father had used her. She nodded, but her expression told me she was terrified of the truth she had just invited into her life. The distance between her and her family grew in small fractures. A tense call here, a clipped remark there. A moment where she defended me and Linda snapped at her. A moment where Ryan rolled his eyes and muttered something about loyalty. But the fracture became real on a warm Friday evening. We were at a family dinner. Claire sat beside me, her hand in mine. And for once, she looked like she had chosen a side. Not fully, not loudly, but enough for Linda to notice. Enough for Harold to feel threatened. Enough for Ryan to glare at her across the table. During dessert, Harold made a snide comment about people who forget where they came from. Claire answered him without hesitation, her voice steady. Maybe some of us grew up and stopped letting fear run our lives. The table went still. Linda hissed her name in warning. Ryan muttered something under his breath. Harold stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time not as his daughter, but as someone he might not be able to control anymore. She squeezed my hand tighter beneath the tablecloth. That was the exact moment I knew the Harper Foundation was beginning to crack. Not because of anything I had done, not because of the envelope, but because Claire had finally started to see the truth her father had spent years hiding from her. I did not know it then, but we were one small step away from the moment everything would collapse. Claire's voice that night stayed with me long after we left her parents' house. It followed me into the car, into our home, into the quiet moments when the TV played without either of us watching. Something inside her had cracked open, and the truth was starting to slip through, piece by piece, whether either of us was ready or not. That weekend, I met with Laura again. Her office was cold, the way law offices tend to feel when the building shuts down for the day. She had spread my documents across her desk like she was laying out pieces of a crime scene. I told her about the tension in the Harper house, the way Harold looked at me as if he knew the envelope could take him down. She pushed a folder toward me and said the situation was worse than either of us had imagined. According to her, the land fraud tied to Sedona in 2009 was not a one-off mistake. It was part of a pattern, a recurring scheme that involved misusing Claire's identity over several years while she was still under Harold's guardianship. That put her at risk, especially if investigators believed she knowingly participated. I asked Laura what would happen if the truth surfaced. She said if the documents leaked in the wrong way, prosecutors could treat Claire as complicit, even if she had been a child at the time. But if we could prove she was coerced or unaware, she would be safe. It was strange hearing a lawyer explain the law's cold logic, while I felt nothing but heat rising under my skin. Harold had used his own daughter as a shield, a child who trusted him, a girl who would have signed anything if he told her to. I felt sick. I felt rage. I felt a clarity I had not felt before. As I walked out into the late afternoon sun, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. The voice on the other end was low, grainy, as if it came through a cheap speaker. "Stop digging or you will regret it." I said nothing. The line clicked dead. That night, I sat in my car for a long time before walking inside. I watched the shadows on the house. I watched the street. I watched for anyone who might be waiting. When I finally stepped inside, Claire was curled up on the couch with the TV muted, her face lit only by the soft flicker of a Christmas movie she was not really watching. She asked me if everything was okay. I lied, said I was just tired, told myself I was protecting her, told myself she was not ready for the truth. But with every lie, a little more weight settled between us. A few days later at work, that weight followed me straight through the glass doors of Northcrest Hospitality. The office buzzed with the tense energy of a deadline week. I had barely reached my desk when Dylan Ward appeared beside me. He leaned on the partition, pretending to be casual, but his eyes told a different story. He said he heard rumors I was juggling too much at once. He smiled in that way people do when the smile is not real. I told him I was fine, that I knew my responsibilities. He nodded, offered a pat on the shoulder, and walked away. But something about the conversation gnawed at me. Dylan had never taken interest in my performance before. He was compliance, a watchdog, not a mentor. And the way he had said juggling sounded like he already knew more about my life than he should. Later that afternoon, I caught him in the hallway speaking quietly to a man I recognized only vaguely. When they noticed me, the conversation ended abruptly. Dylan walked past like nothing happened. The other man disappeared behind the elevator doors. Something was moving behind the scenes, and I could feel Harold's influence crawling into my professional world. I just did not know how deeply yet. That evening, as I pulled into our driveway, I noticed something off. The mailbox door was latched, but tilted slightly. Inside was a white envelope with no markings, no stamp, no handwriting at all. I felt every muscle in my shoulders tighten. I carried it inside, waited until Claire was in the shower, and opened it alone in the dim kitchen. Inside was a single printed sentence. "Bury the past and live quietly." My hands trembled. Whoever sent it wanted me afraid, wanted me compliant, wanted me silent. I folded the paper and hid it deep in the toolbox in the garage. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside dragged my attention. A car slowing, a dog barking, a door closing across the street. I kept replaying the threat over and over, each word sinking deeper. 2 days later, I received a call from Evelyn Brooks again. She said someone had knocked on her door, asking questions about the Harpers. She sounded frightened. Said the man kept trying to convince her she remembered things wrong. She asked me if it was connected to what I was doing. I told her to stop talking to strangers and to call me if anyone approached her again. After the call ended, I realized I was dragging others into the storm. People who had no way to defend themselves if Harold decided to strike back. I sat on the edge of the bed, head in my hands, the envelope lying beside me like a silent reminder of what I had set in motion. Claire walked in. She sat down beside me and rested her head on my shoulder. She asked if I wanted to talk. I told her not tonight. I felt her disappointment like a physical ache. But I could not give her half the truth. It would only confuse her, hurt her, scare her. Another week passed. The holiday season closed in, the one time of year when families pretend everything is perfect. But ours was unraveling slowly, thread by thread. One night, as Claire and I were cleaning up after dinner, she turned to me and asked if I believed her father was capable of using her in ways she did not understand when she was young. I froze. She looked at me, waiting. Her eyes held a quiet desperation, as if she already knew the answer and only needed me to confirm it. I told her she had been manipulated all her life. She sat at the table and pressed both hands to her forehead. She whispered that she had always felt something was wrong, but never dared say it out loud. She looked up at me and said maybe that was why they never wanted her to move out. Why they controlled her finances. Why they made her feel small every time she tried to stand on her own. Maybe they needed her identity more than they needed her presence. I could not deny it. Not anymore. A few days later, Harold called her out of nowhere. His tone was sharp and demanding. He asked if she had been talking to anyone about old family business. She said no. He pressed harder. She held her ground. When she hung up, she was shaking. That was the moment she finally admitted she was afraid of him. Everything shifted after that. Small things at first. She stopped answering Linda's daily texts. She avoided her father's calls. She canceled a brunch with Ryan. It was not rebellion. It was self-preservation. But the Harpers sensed it and reacted with escalating desperation. Linda left a voicemail saying Claire was tearing the family apart. Ryan accused her of choosing me over blood. Harold sent a cold message saying they needed to have a serious conversation soon and that he did not appreciate secrets in his household. Claire played it off during the day. But at night, I could feel tension radiating from her like heat. The envelope had not just shaken Harold. It had awakened something inside her that had been asleep for years. The turning point came during a visit to their house a week before Christmas. Harold stared at me the moment we walked in. Eyes sharp, jaw tight. Claire barely made it to the living room before he began questioning her again. She stood her ground this time. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply told him that she was an adult and that he did not get to dictate her every move anymore. Linda gasped. Ryan swore under his breath. Harold's face darkened. He stepped toward her. Instinct took over. I moved between them. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I saw something raw in them. Not anger, not pride, fear. He knew his power over her was slipping. He knew I had done something to weaken his grip. He just did not know how much I knew yet. When we left that night, Claire gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. She said she had thought her family was strict, maybe controlling. But she had not realized how much of her life had been decided for her. She looked at me and whispered that if there was something else she needed to know, she was ready. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hand her everything and let the truth free her. But I knew revealing it too soon would crush her before she had the strength to stand on her own. I told her she would know soon. She nodded, though uncertainty flickered behind her eyes. That night, while she slept, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the envelope again. Every choice I had made since receiving it had led us to this moment. Every lie of omission, every step toward the truth, every risk. I felt the old fear return, crawling up my spine. Not for myself, for her. For what she would face when she finally saw who her family really was. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, knowing we were heading straight toward a confrontation none of us could avoid. The envelope stayed on the nightstand while I dressed for work the next morning, its presence heavy enough to bend the air around it. I forced myself to look away and focus on the day ahead. But something in my gut told me the Harpers were already pushing their influence into places far beyond their home. That feeling only grew stronger as I drove into downtown Phoenix and stepped through the revolving doors of Northcrest Hospitality. The building hummed with the same energy it always did during high-pressure weeks, but something felt off. Conversation stopped a moment too quickly when I walked by. Eyes lingered a fraction longer. I could feel a current under the surface, like the water level was rising, and everyone sensed it except me. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and barely had time to type my password before Dylan Ward appeared beside me. He leaned against the cubicle wall with that practiced, casual posture he always used when he was about to deliver bad news wrapped in fake empathy. "Morning, Aaron. Big week. You ready for the fire?" I told him I was. He gave a slow nod, tapped my desk with 2 fingers, and walked away without another word. My stomach tightened. I had no reason to distrust him a year ago. But he had been circling me for weeks now, checking my reports, asking about delays that never happened, hinting that upper management was watching my performance closely. At 11, I received the first blow. An internal message from operations flagged a budget discrepancy in the Flagstaff expansion project. $180,000 over the approved cost model. That should have been impossible. I triple-checked those numbers. Every line item was verified, every invoice accounted for. Yet the system showed that I had approved an expense revision late the previous night. I stared at the timestamp. 2:15 a.m. I was asleep. I stood up and walked straight to it. A technician named Marcus pulled the audit logs. He scrolled, frowned, scrolled again. Someone had used my credentials to access the financial module after hours, injected new numbers into the model, and cleared the breadcrumbs that would normally show the chain of edits. Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. Looks like a coordinated override, not something a random employee could do. Someone with access, someone with authority, someone like Dylan. I asked him to save a copy of the raw logs. He hesitated, then nodded and created a secure file for me. As I left it, a cold sweat slid down my back. At 2, I was called into a conference room. The long glass table was full. Regional directors, operations heads, senior VP. Dylan sat near the front with a stack of papers, his expression too calm for the emergency that had just been declared. The meeting started with Ortiz, our CEO, laying out the issue. He was measured, authoritative, and calm. But the tension in his jaw told me he already knew this was more than a budgeting mistake. He turned to Dylan and asked him to walk the room through the discrepancy. Dylan acted reluctant, as if he hated being the bearer of bad news. He fanned out the printed spreadsheets like he had uncovered evidence in a courtroom. He pointed to the inflated numbers, then to the audit logs that appeared to show my approval. He let the silence linger, waiting for the weight of the accusation to settle on me. I felt every eye shift in my direction. He finally spoke with the tone of someone concerned for company integrity. It looks like Aaron made emergency adjustments without routing them through compliance. This kind of unilateral decision-making could expose us to liability if it becomes a pattern. Pattern? He said it with just enough emphasis to plant doubt. I kept my hands folded on the table because they were shaking with anger. He had doctored the logs. He had staged the entire setup. And I knew exactly where the courage to do that came from. Harold Harper. The man could not reach me directly without exposing himself. So he reached for the one place he knew I could not afford to crumble. My career. Ortiz cleared his throat and asked for my explanation. He looked at me not like a man expecting guilt, but like a man who wanted to understand. I respected him for that. It kept me from exploding. I stood and told them I did not make the change. That my badge had been used without my knowledge. That I believed someone had manipulated the system. Dylan scoffed quietly under his breath, loud enough for the room to hear. Before I could continue, the door opened, and Marcus from ET stepped inside holding a small flash drive. He walked up to Ortiz, whispered something, and handed it over. Ortiz plugged it into the conference room computer and displayed the unfiltered logs on the screen. The real logs. The ones Dylan did not expect to resurface. There it was. The access trail. Not my ID. Not my device signature. Another user profile had been used to spoof my credentials. The real timestamp. A secondary login. Cross-referenced entries tied to a workstation in Dylan's wing. And worst of all, a brief access attempt registered to a device associated with Ryan Harper's email domain. A domain that had no business accessing Northcrest systems. The room stiffened. No one breathed. Dylan's face turned a blotchy red. And for the first time since I had known him, he had no smile to hide behind. Ortiz pulled off his glasses and set them on the table. His voice was calm in a way that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Dylan, step outside. Now. The door clicked shut behind him. The room stayed silent for several long seconds, the tension crawling across everyone's skin. Ortiz finally turned to me, his expression softened by a degree. He said they would initiate an immediate investigation, and that Dylan would be placed on leave effective immediately. He apologized for the accusation. He asked if I was comfortable continuing to lead the Flagstaff project while the internal review unfolded. I said yes, but the truth was I felt anything but comfortable. If Harold had pushed this far into my workplace, he would not stop now. He would escalate. He would find another angle. I left the meeting with a tightness in my chest that would not ease. Northcrest had been my refuge. The part of my life untouched by the weight of the Harper family. Now that line had been breached. As I walked through the lobby toward the elevators, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. The same format as the envelope threat. You have made a mistake. Stop before the damage spreads. I stared at the message until my vision blurred. My pulse climbed. This was no longer about secrets. No longer about hidden documents or family disputes. Someone was actively moving pieces against me. Someone who did not fear consequences. Someone with the resources to infiltrate financial systems and track my every move. When I reached the parking garage, I spotted a black sedan idling near my car. My heart kicked into a higher gear. But as I approached, it pulled away slowly and blended into traffic. No plates I could memorize. No face I could recognize. Just the fading certainty that the walls were closing in faster than I had anticipated. That evening at home, Claire noticed my hands shaking as I chopped vegetables for dinner. She asked if work was getting to me. I said yes. It was easier than telling her the truth. She stepped behind me, wrapped her arms around my waist, and rested her cheek between my shoulder blades. I felt her steady breaths. I felt the warmth of her trust, and I felt the dread of the moment that trust would fracture when she finally saw what her family had done. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I sat at my desk in the dark reading through every document again. The transactions, the signatures, the land transfers, the timestamps, the emails Evelyn had forwarded me, and now the attack at North Crest. This was not coincidence. This was strategy. Harold was covering his tracks while trying to sever mine. Every step forward made him push harder. I stared at the envelope one more time, my pulse thudding in my ears. If Harold was already willing to sabotage my career, I knew the next move would be worse. Much worse. The storm was coming faster than I had expected, and I no longer had the luxury of waiting to act. I woke the next morning with the certainty that whatever line had been crossed at North Crest was only the beginning. The threat message, the tampered logs, the black sedan watching the garage. All of it pointed to a man who felt his control slipping and was now striking wildly to keep it. I tried to steady my breathing as I got ready for work, but the sense of urgency clung to me like a second skin. Still, nothing prepared me for what would happen next. The day crawled along as if the clock hands were dragging through mud. Meetings blurred together, emails piled up. People passed me in the hallway with neutral expressions that felt a little too careful. Every time my phone vibrated, I expected another warning, another threat. But it stayed silent. Silent in a way that made me even more uneasy. By late afternoon, I realized what that silence meant. Something was building. Something was coming. I just did not know from which direction. When evening rolled around, Claire and I drove to her parents' house for the Christmas dinner. The one that, in my memory, split our lives into before and after. The sky over Scottsdale was a deep crimson fading into night. The kind of winter sunset that feels like a warning. Claire sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts miles away. Neither of us spoke much. Neither of us needed to. The tension between her and her family had grown denser with every passing day. She felt it. I felt it. Even the air in the car felt heavy. When we pulled into the driveway, the Harper house glowed with decorations designed to impress rather than welcome. A manicured yard, twinkling lights, a door wreath bigger than my torso. Everything perfect on the surface, everything rotting underneath. Inside, the dinner table looked like something out of a magazine. Silverware arranged in perfect symmetry, crystal glasses catching every reflection. The smell of roasted turkey and pine filled the room. Holiday music played softly, pretending this was just an ordinary Christmas, not the beginning of a storm. I sat down beside Claire, across from us. Harold carved the turkey with the confidence of a man who believed he still owned the room. Ryan scrolled his phone, glancing up occasionally with a smirk he did not bother hiding. Linda poured herself wine and avoided meeting my eyes, something she never used to do. Conversation began in pieces. Safe topics at first: work, weather, holiday sales. Everyone danced around the tension as if ignoring it would make it disappear. But tension has a way of growing even when no one speaks it aloud. Halfway through dinner, Harold lifted his glass, just like in my memory. The way he tapped it, the way his smile tightened, the way people looked at him with expectation. It all happened exactly as it had before, except this time. I knew what was coming, and I knew that once he opened the envelope sitting in my jacket pocket, nothing would ever look the same again. His voice boomed over the table. He talked about family, about loyalty, about knowing who belonged and who did not. His eyes slid to me with practiced disdain. I felt Claire tense beside me. Then came the gesture I had been replaying for months. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a single-dollar bill. Crumpled, cheap, a prop for humiliation. He tossed it at me. It landed with a soft sound against my cheek and fell onto the table. Everything slowed. Every memory of the past 3 years converged on that single insult. I felt rage. I felt clarity. I felt the weight of everything he had done to Claire long before I ever entered her life. For a second, I saw Claire's face fall. The betrayal in her eyes, impossible to miss. That was the moment I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope. I set it gently in front of Harold, my voice steady. "You should open that." The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like air had stopped moving. The holiday music became a distant hum. No one laughed now, not even Ryan. Harold narrowed his eyes and picked up the envelope with a dismissive gesture, as if expecting a childish attempt at revenge. But the moment he felt the thickness of the documents inside, something shifted. His brows dipped. His smirk faltered. He opened it slowly, pulling out the first page. He read only the top half before his expression changed. The smug confidence drained from his face, like someone had pulled the plug on the man he pretended to be. He looked at Claire, then at me, then back at the paper as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less damning. Linda noticed first. "What is it, Harold?" Her voice trembled. He did not answer. Ryan stood, trying to lean over and look. Claire's breath hitched. A ripple of unease passed through the room. I sat still. My hands did not shake this time. My breath was steady. My voice stayed quiet in my chest. Harold opened the second page, and the third. With each one, his hands shook more. By the fourth page, he looked like a man who had fallen through ice and realized the water beneath would drown him. He finally snapped. His voice erupted across the table. "Where did you get this?" His face turned crimson. His hand slammed the papers onto the table. His gaze burned through me with a mixture of panic and fury. I said nothing before he could speak again. Harold's phone buzzed loudly. He snatched it up. His face went pale as he read the screen. His hand trembled so violently he nearly dropped the phone. Linda asked again what was happening. Ryan reached for the envelope. Harold barked at him to sit down. Claire stared at the documents scattered across the table, then at her father. She whispered, "Dad, what did you do?" He did not answer. He could not. The silence around him said more than words could. I watched his jaw clench, his mind racing as the truth he had buried for a decade clawed its way to the surface. Then he made the mistake I had been waiting for. He pointed at me and shouted that the files were fake, that I was lying, that I had manipulated everything to tear his family apart. His voice shook. His denial was frantic, the kind that reveals more truth than it hides. Claire stepped between us before he could take a step toward me. Her voice broke. "Tell me the truth, Dad." Her eyes were filling fast. She looked at him as if seeing a stranger wearing his skin. Ryan moved behind Harold, his expression shifting from anger to fear. Linda clutched the tablecloth like she needed it to stay upright. The moment stretched. Every person in the room was waiting for someone else to speak. But the next blow did not come from Harold. It came from Claire's phone buzzing in her hand. She looked down, her face drained of color. It was an email. The sender was a name she did not recognize. But I did. A journalist, a man who had spent weeks digging through county archives, a man who had promised he would not release anything until I gave him the signal. Yet there it was. A forwarded packet of documents. Additional evidence, scans, testimony, a summary of the Sedona record retrieval. Everything laid bare. Her hands shook as she turned the screen toward her father. He froze. I watched the realization hit him. His secrets were no longer surrounded by the safety of his walls or his influence. They were in the world now. A single crack echoed across the room as Harold's composure snapped. "Get out!" His voice rasped through clenched teeth. "Get out of my house." He pointed at me, then at Claire. "Leave now." Claire stared at him, something inside her breaking with a quiet finality. She grabbed her coat. I grabbed mine. The room behind us exploded into angry mutters and frantic whispers. But none of it mattered. The cold night air hit us as we stepped outside. Claire stopped on the walkway, breathing hard. Her face pale and wet with tears she did not bother wiping away. She turned to me with a voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you known?" Her question hung between us, heavy, honest, terrifying. I opened my mouth to answer. I told her the truth had come together piece by piece, slower than I wanted, but too clearly to ignore. And her breath caught, as if a cold wind had passed straight through her. We stood there in the dim glow of the porch lights, our shadows stretching across the walkway, neither of us ready to break the silence. She stared at the gravel under her feet, then lifted her eyes to mine, searching for something she was not sure she wanted to find. She whispered that she needed space, just a moment to breathe, and she walked a few steps away, with her arms wrapped around herself. I let her go. The air felt sharp, like the cold night was pressing against my skin. The Harper house behind us trembled with raised voices. I heard Linda shouting, Ryan yelling back, a door slamming, glass breaking. It was the sound of a family cracking open at the seams. Claire finally turned toward me again. She asked what her father had done. All of it, not sugar-coated, not protected. She said she was done living in the dark. So I told her. The land records, the forged signatures, the silent payoffs, the threats sent through proxies, the way he had buried her mother's trust fund beneath shell paperwork that only looked legitimate from a distance. I watched her face tighten with each detail, her breath hitching, her body curling inward as if she needed to shield herself from the truth. She kept wiping her eyes, but the tears kept coming. When I finished, she did not collapse. She did not scream. She simply nodded once, as if accepting a truth she had already sensed long before I ever said it. She walked toward me and leaned her forehead against my chest. I held her carefully, not sure if she wanted comfort or just a place to steady herself. She whispered that she wished I had told her sooner, but she understood why I had waited. She said she knew now that her father had been lying to her for years, and that everything she had defended him for suddenly felt like a betrayal of herself. We drove back to my apartment in silence. She held my arm the whole way, but did not speak. When we stepped inside, she kicked off her shoes, sat on the couch, and stared at the coffee table for what felt like hours. I made tea neither of us drank. When I finally asked if she wanted to sleep, she shook her head and said she needed to see the evidence again. All of it. So I laid everything out on the table, the scanned affidavits, the property records, the emails. She read until her eyes were red and swollen. Then she closed the last folder and said she wanted to take legal action. Not tomorrow, but now. She said she was done letting her father dictate what she deserved. Before I could respond, headlights flashed across the blinds. A car rolled to a stop outside my building. Another pulled up behind it. Then another. I went to the window and froze. It was Harold's security team. Not the professional firm he hired for his real estate properties, but the private group he used whenever he needed muscle without documentation. Claire came to stand beside me, and her hand flew to her mouth. They were checking license plates, searching the parking lot, talking into radios. One of them looked up at my window. I stepped back. Claire whispered that we needed to call someone. I grabbed my phone, but before I could dial, there was a knock at the door. Firm, controlled. The kind of knock meant to intimidate, Claire's voice trembled when she said my name. The knock came again. I motioned for her to get into the bedroom and lock the door. She hesitated until I promised I would not open the door. When she disappeared down the hall, her footsteps light and frightened. I approached the door quietly. Another knock. This time louder. A man's voice said he needed a word with me. He claimed it was about the incident at the Harper residence. He sounded calm. Too calm. I did not answer. I stood perfectly still. After a moment, the knock stopped. Then I heard footsteps moving down the hall. More voices. They were discussing whether they had the right apartment. Someone said they were sure. Another said they should wait by the car and see if anyone came out. The footsteps faded. I stayed there, listening through the peephole until the hallway was empty. Then I called Noah. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been expecting my call. I told him everything in a low voice. He told me not to panic. He told me to stay inside. He said he would handle the next steps legally and personally. He also said that whatever Harold thought he could do that night, he would regret by morning. I hung up and went to check on Claire. She was curled on the edge of the bed, knees pulled to her chest, still wearing her coat. I sat beside her, and she leaned into me without speaking. After a long silence, she asked what was going to happen to her father. I told her the truth. I said the investigations were already underway, and once the financial documents reached the state auditors and the county attorney's office, there would be subpoenas, interviews, freezes on accounts, and eventually charges. She asked if he would go to prison. I said yes. Not out of anger, but out of certainty. She started crying again, not loudly, just soft and steady, tears falling onto her hands. She said she hated him for what he did, but still loved him because he was her father. She said she did not know how to hold both feelings at once. I told her she didn't have to decide that now. She nodded and rested her head on my shoulder. Hours passed. The apartment grew quiet. The parking lot emptied except for one black SUV that idled too long before finally pulling away. When the street fell silent, Claire crawled under the blankets and whispered for me to stay close. I lay beside her and held her while her breathing slowly steadied. She drifted to sleep with her hand gripping mine as if afraid that if she let go, everything around her would collapse again. But I could not sleep. My mind kept replaying the look on Harold's face when the truth hit him. The panic in his voice, the rage, the fear. I knew men like him. Cornered men. Men who spent years building illusions and could not survive without them. Men who believed they were untouchable until the moment they realized they were not. At 2 a.m, my phone lit up with a message from Noah. It contained one sentence. They moved funds tonight. You were right. The walls are closing in. I set the phone down slowly. Claire's breathing was warm against my shoulder. The night outside was silent. But for the first time since this all began, I felt something shift inside me. A sense that we were finally nearing the end of the maze Harold had built. A storm was coming for him, and this time he would not outrun it. The message from Noah kept replaying in my head long after the screen went dark. Funds had moved. Harold was scrambling. When men like him felt the ground shift, they made mistakes. And mistakes were exactly what we needed. I lay there staring at the ceiling until the black outside the window softened into early gray. Claire was still asleep, her hand loosely draped over my chest, her breathing slow and uneven like her body was still fighting through the night before. I slipped out of bed gently and walked to the kitchen. I brewed coffee mostly out of habit, though my stomach was too tight to drink it. While it dripped, I kept glancing at the front door, half expecting another knock, The silence unnerved me more than the noise from the night before. By the time Claire woke, my phone had already buzzed 3 more times. Noah was gathering everything for the county financial crimes unit. A state investigator wanted to schedule an interview, and a reporter from Phoenix had reached out with questions he should not have known to ask. Harold's walls were cracking faster than I expected. Claire came out wrapped in a blanket, her hair tangled, her face pale. She sat across from me at the table and stared at her hands. She asked if any of this could be stopped, if her father could still fix it, if the fallout could be softened. I told her the truth. Once the state stepped in, nobody could stop what was coming. She closed her eyes like she already knew, but needed to hear it out loud. She wanted to see the documents again. So I slid the files back in front of her. She scanned through them slowly, her breath catching every time she reached another forged signature, another payout, another lie. When she reached the final page, she let out a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a sob. She asked if she could be the one to hand everything to the investigators. I nodded. It was her right, maybe even her closure. Noah picked us up an hour later. He drove a steel gray sedan instead of his usual truck, which told me he was taking this more seriously than he wanted to admit. He barely spoke as we rode downtown to the Maricopa County building. He had a stack of folders in the passenger seat with sticky notes poking out the sides like little warning flags. Inside the office, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the investigators ushered us into a small interview room with neutral walls and a battered metal table. They asked Claire if she was ready to proceed. Her voice trembled, but she said yes. Then she handed over the evidence, 1 page at a time, her fingers trembling, but her eyes steady. The lead investigator listened closely, nodding at times, asking clarifying questions about dates, signatures, property lines, and prior conversations with her father. Claire answered everything with a quiet resolve that impressed even Noah. By the time she finished, the investigator closed the folder carefully and said they would be issuing orders within days. They would contact us once the next steps were confirmed. Walking out of that building felt like leaving a storm shelter just as a tornado passed overhead. In the parking lot, Claire leaned against the car and took a long, shaky breath. She told me she did not know if she felt relieved or sick. I told her it was normal to feel both. She slid into the passenger seat without another word. 2 days later, the hammer dropped. I woke to my phone vibrating non-stop. Calls, messages, alerts, local news headlines flashing across the screen. Harper Real Estate CEO under investigation. Search warrants executed at 4 properties. Accounts frozen pending review. Allegations of fraud and asset concealment. Within minutes, the footage hit the internet. Agents walking into Harold's company headquarters. Officers loading boxes into vans outside his Scottsdale home. Reporters gathering at the gates. The last clip showed Harold himself stepping out of the front door, his face ashen, his hands lifted as officers directed him forward for questioning. Claire watched everything from the couch. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She just stared, her expression hollow but strangely calm. Then she whispered that it was finally over. I sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, unsure whether she needed comfort or space. She leaned into me, choosing comfort. Later that afternoon, Noah arrived with updates. He said the evidence was overwhelming. State charges were almost guaranteed. The federal side was beginning to sniff around as well. He also said Harold's legal team had reached out to negotiate, something they usually did only when they knew the fight was already lost. Then Noah handed me a small envelope. It was addressed to Claire. One of the investigators had been asked to pass it along. Claire hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short, handwritten note from her father. The words were uneven, rushed, almost desperate. He said he knew the truth had found him. He said he was sorry she had been dragged into it. And at the bottom, he wrote something that made her close the note and hand it back to me. He wrote that he never expected his own daughter to be the one who brought him down. Claire whispered that even at the end, he blamed everyone but himself. That night, she asked if she could stay at my place for a while. Not because she wanted to avoid the media, but because the house she grew up in no longer felt like a home. I told her she could stay as long as she needed. She fell asleep on my shoulder again. But this time her breathing was steady. A week passed, then 2. The investigation deepened. Charges were drafted. Witnesses were lined up. And eventually, a court date was scheduled. There was no celebration, no victory lap, just a quiet sense that justice was finally moving in a straight line after years of circling in the dark. When the day finally came, Claire and I drove to the courthouse together. The sky was clear, the air warm. Reporters lined the steps. Her father arrived in a navy suit that looked a size too big, escorted by attorneys who wore expressions of practiced neutrality. He glanced at Claire once, then looked away quickly, almost ashamed. Though maybe that was just my wishful thinking. Inside the courtroom, everything felt still. The judge read each charge slowly. Fraud, forgery, misappropriation of assets, wire manipulation, tax evasion. The words echoed like stones dropping into deep water. Harold sat stiffly, staring forward. When he finally spoke, his voice shook. He pleaded guilty on several counts. Some deals had been struck behind closed doors, but the weight of his crimes was too heavy to escape. When sentencing was announced, Claire did not look at him. She kept her eyes on her hands, folded tightly in her lap. I watched her father sink back into his chair, his face drained of the authority he had once wielded like a weapon. Outside the courthouse, Claire took a long breath and looked at me with an expression I had not seen in months. Peace, not joy, not triumph, just a quiet release of everything she had carried for years. She said she wanted to rebuild, not from her father's wealth, which was gone now, but from her own choices. She said she wanted to build a life where truth mattered more than appearances, a life where she could finally breathe. I told her I wanted the same, for the first time. She smiled like the future was something she could trust again. If you have followed this story all the way to the end, I hope you felt the weight of every step and the strength it takes to stand up for the truth. If you want more stories like this, stories about justice, redemption, and the fight to reclaim your own life, let me know in the comments and stay with the channel. There is more to tell, and I would be glad to have you here for the next one.